Hello there, good evening to you. This is Sky News at 9. You're watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages. As they arrive in the next half hour, we'll see what's making tomorrow's headlines with entrepreneur James Caan and The Guardian's women's editor, Jane Martinston. Welcome to both of you. Good to see you. Thanks for coming in. The eye there, unions defy Miliband to threaten an autumn of strikes. Was it right, do you think, that the Labour leader wanted to come out and say they were wrong to hold strikes earlier this year?
I think he was, because if you look at how fragile the economy is right now, the last thing we need, I think, as a country is to have 1 million people on strike, because it's not just the strikes, but it's the effect that it causes on business, on schools, on teachers. It just turns the whole country upside down. And I think if you just look at what we're seeing right now from an economic perspective, I think, what he's doing, from my point of view, I think is absolutely correct. We should avoid
You're one of the
those.
bosses, though, aren't you? You're not one of the you're not one of the workers. Do you know what I mean? Who feel that their jobs are being squeezed at a time when the cost of living, as we heard there, is rising.
No, but I think you've got to look at both sides of it. Because the impact of people going on strike. Of course, I support the workers because I see they want more money, etc. But at the same time, is this right now a time to be doing that? So I think Miliband is right in what he's doing.
You could question why he's doing it now, though. I mean, his popularity rose before the summer break with all the stuff about hacking, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. And he chooses today, of all days, to turn up at the TUC and criticise the unions for striking over pensions, which is something which are finally really striking a chord amongst an electorate who are actually very worried about the future, possibly for the first time in a generation for some. So I thought it was quite interesting. I mean, it's obviously very interesting positioning in terms of Ed Miliband was seen as very much supported by the unions when he was elected as Labour leader and criticised hugely by all the Tory press for that. So now he's obviously trying to distance himself from...
Of sorts, I guess. It's not the strongest heckling you'll ever hear, but in terms of pensions that you mentioned there, are they simply unaffordable for this country, do you think, as they stand currently?
I mean, the whole pensions arena is very difficult right now. If you just look at the stock market, where majority of our pensions were invested, the stock market has virtually kind of halved in some cases. So it really is a big issue right now, no question about it.
And do people in the public sector have better pensions than those in the private sector?
I think they do. That's the issue.
Although, I mean, traditionally they have had better pensions, but that's because they have always had lower pay. So it's been that quid pro quo, isn't it, that you choose to work in the public sector, knowing that you will earn less than you possibly would if you worked in the private sector. But you work in a job where you get lower pay because of the paying conditions, thinking that the public sector will look after you in your retirement is a classic case. So, I mean, you talk to
now being diluted.
You talk to police officers, though, who say, and these are police officers in their 40s, who say, at 20 they signed up for 30 years, they've worked really hard, but not earned a huge amount of money, but in 10 years' time they're looking to retire. Now they're being told, no, you're not. Now, you could say, and lots of people in the private sector do, you're retiring in your 50s, because obviously the private sector pensions have been completely decimated with the end of final salary schemes. But that's still quite hard to bear if you're someone who's spent their 20-year career in a police force and is now looking to retire.
Well, there's all sorts of other pressures on the economy. If we take a look now at the Financial Times, not least the defaulting issues of Greece and other Euro nations, how afraid should we be, do you think?
Well, I'm just looking right now at the banks across the board. I mean, since this story is broke, I mean, the shares of banks have really been decimated. Whether you're in Europe, the US, whether it's Goldman Sachs or Lloyds Bank or RBS, I mean, this whole issue with the banking sector right now, almost to the point now where you're starting to look at some of these banks, the prices have come so low that there's almost a fear that they could be nationalised. So, I do think this whole banking crisis, I thought, in the summer we'd got over the worst of it, but it just seems to get worse day by day.
Well, it's the French banks that are now under pressure, a big exposure to Italy's debt as well, they're saying. But this story is about Angela Merkel, who is seeking to quash speculation that a Greek default is imminent, insisting that no such event could happen before 2013, so some years off. But it's very costly for Europe, isn't it? And very costly in terms of market confidence too.
Very difficult politically, I mean, for Angela Merkel and also for Sarkozy, because their own voters are very unhappy about the situation, particularly in Germany, where they feel as if they are having to pay lots of money, whereas she's obviously dedicated to making sure that the Eurozone does actually keep quite strong.
But, you only need one economy to kind of default, and God knows, the trickle effect, once Greece defaults, who knows where this crisis is going to end. If you just look at what happened with Lehman's, I think looking back, I think a lot of people are saying we shouldn't have allowed it to happen because the consequences were so bad. I think, with Greece defaulting, and then you've got so many other economies that are so fragile. You look at Ireland or Portugal or Spain. My fear isn't Greece, but it's the consequences, what happens if it does default.
Well, pressures at home as well. If we look at the story down here, Treasury warns ministers to nail down spending in departments. They say to forget about dipping into the reserve as the coalition tightens its fiscal resolve in the face of what Nick Clegg calls a stark new economic reality. So the squeeze is still on, by all accounts.
I noticed in one of the articles that even the government themselves, I think, as far as MPs are concerned, they're cutting 12 million by cutting the number of MPs. I must admit, it's actually good to see that they're starting at home. It's not just, in public sector generally, but even MPs themselves. You can really see that the coalition government are really taking this quite seriously.
Are you all for the spending cuts, both of you, or do you think there will be an impact on the economy?
I think there will be, but the question is, what do you do if you can't afford to spend the money? If you don't have the money to spend, you have to cut. I think if you're in business and you see your revenues, collapsing and your income is halved, you can't continue to spend. So I think, to me, as a businessman, I see, Cameron and Clegg are being responsible, because if they don't cut, when will we get out of this mess? So I think they're having to be prudent, and they aren't exactly doing that.
I think there is a danger, and lots of economists have talked about this, of actually just cutting. There's no money going in to stimulate the economy. Actually, what's happening is, with the public sector cuts and the private sector really being squeezed, that the economy is sort of spiralling into
But do we
what could be
go and borrow
deflation.
more money? We can't continue to borrow.
No, we can't keep borrowing, but we should be doing something to try
From
to
where?
generate. In this story itself, the Adam Posum is saying that maybe trying to pump money into the economy by having state-owned banks, for example, lend to small businesses, which we failed to do. You mentioned Lehman's. How ironic that Lehman's collapses at the end of 2008, then leading to lots of our own banks effectively becoming state-owned. We do nothing about trying to get them to lend to small-sized businesses, such as entrepreneurs that want to start up. There is no help. There's been no guarantees, no forcing them to actually help stimulate small businesses in a world in which lots of people are losing their jobs.
Just very quickly, I wonder if we've got time for one more paper before we take a break, which is The Independent, exposed after 8 years of private eyes dirty work for Fleet Street. They say, The Independent, they've seen files detailing 17,000 requests to investigator Steve Whittemore, who is a name that's been in the frame for some years, hasn't he?
Obviously in that Times front page there was no mention of James Murdoch being recalled to speak before MPs about phone hacking. Obviously this is a story that Nick Davis at The Guardian has been writing about for at least 2 years. Steve Whittemore was the original investigator, and it was 2003, and The Independent seems to have done this great work on finding evidence, talking to the former police officer involved about other newspapers. They've mentioned the Sunday Express there. Evidence, it says that they got the private telephone number of the parents of one of the children killed by Ian Huntley in the Soham murders.
That's not the same as hacking, though, is it? Obtaining a private telephone number?
Well, I think what they're suggesting there actually is that there was, that the numbers, the fact that the numbers were obtained, having just read that front page, it suggests that hacking or some sort of illegal act or dirty work is how they're obviously what they've described to us in the headline, was much more widespread than we.
But they're implicating a number of other newspapers. I think what I take from this article is it kind of demonstrates that it's not just the News of the World. This is a practice that was quite common across a lot of newspapers, and I think in a way News Corp has really become the fall guy out of this, because if this story is to be believed, frankly, it appears they're all at it.
I think there are obviously different things here. This was this was the use of private
So you're a
investing.
journalist with a newspaper, aren't you?
With the Guardian, yes, no, I am. But I also think this is, this is a very long-running inquiry, and the investigation that went on there about the use of private investigators and how widespread that, the dark arts of Fleet Street, as they've been called, I think is of a different magnitude that what the police are investigating, which is, I'm not in any way condoning this.
But this is saying even policemen
But I
were on
think
the
saying
payroll.
that the News Corp is in some way a fall guy is not the takeaway from this front page story.
No, what I'm saying is that it just appears to me that this is not just one newspaper. This is a practice that exists amongst all newspapers, and therefore clearly, I'm not saying
all
one's right.
newspapers. I don't think even the use of private investigators is not all newspapers. And there are, unless it is for there is a public interest defence, which
No, I
is the
accept.
key
I just think
defence.
the phrase here, it uses illegal methods. That was the kind of point that I picked up, which clearly is not acceptable.
Are you saying that the Guardian don't use private investigators for anything?
No, I think what we've said on the record is the only time the editor would in any way sanction, and has done over decades, the use of private investigators is when there is an obvious and clear public interest defence.
But that in itself is not illegal, though, is it?
No. Well, there is a defence for,
Correct.
if any action were brought, it's an absolutely straight, down the line defence. So I suppose the only bit I was querying was the suggestion that somehow everyone's been focusing on News Corporation and the News of the World, and it happens everywhere, and it's just all newspapers. I think that's an incredibly dangerous route to take, and actually really very troubling for a sort of press democracy.
Yeah,
Sure.
This will probably make an interesting read for people, certainly. Steve Whittemore, a different name from Glenn Mulcair, the person we've heard about so recently. Lots more of the papers.